But at the same time, in terms of equipment, Russia is using its Soviet stockpiles, tries to modernize them, especially in terms of heavy equipment, and send them to the front lines. They still suffer heavy attrition. And now I think we're coming to the point, there are multiple assessments of these, that sooner or later Russia will have to make a decision what to do next.
This is a conversation with Kirill Shamiev. Kirill is a fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, where he primarily focuses on the Russian military. And that's exactly what we talked about. We discussed what is the state of the Russian military today, 2.5 years into the war, whether it's able to learn and improve, what was the meaning behind the purges at the Russian Ministry of Defense, how much corruption affects Russian combat capability, or how fast it will be able to rebuild its military to potentially face NATO. Thank you to everyone who supports this podcast on Patreon, and if you don't, consider becoming a supporter. You will help me make more of these interviews that take a surprising amount of time and effort to put together, and you will get full ad-free episodes and bonus content. And now, enjoy the conversation. So, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for inviting me.
So, I think a good way to start, if we're going to be talking about the Russian military, would be by looking at what shape it is today. So let's start with that. And it's quite a simple, but at the same time, it's a pretty big question. So if you look at the Russian military today, what is your assessment of its shape and its capabilities at the moment? And how do you think how would you say it changed since the start of the war?
Well, first, I think we need to say that we're recording this podcast in July, in the middle of the summer, so Russia can attempt another offenses, for example, in August or later in autumn, and this can change the assessment of Russia's military capabilities. But currently, the Russian military, as after the announcement of the partial mobilization, it's a mobilized force with a lot of personnel. Treated though already, but the Moscow manages to enlist more personnel through forced or like recruitment of so-called volunteers. But in some cases, this means they were just forced to sign contracts and sent to the front lines, convicts, and numerous types of people who decided to fight against Ukraine. These, after almost 2 years since the announcement of the mobilization, these people gain a lot of experience for obvious reasons, and also because Moscow banned them from leaving the military. So those who survived and are not heavily injured, and those who also were injured but then sent back to the military, these people who's got a lot of experience. So in this regard, in terms of its personnel quality, at least their fighting skills, we see an improvement of Russia's skills, not only of the enlisted personnel, but also military officers who's famously, it's well researched that Russia's military is capable of adapting, and they learned by doing from their mistakes. But at the same time, in terms of equipment, Russia is using its Soviet stockpiles, tries to modernize them, especially in terms of heavy equipment, and send them to the front lines. They still suffer heavy attrition. And now I think we're coming to the point, there are multiple assessments of these, including by using like satellite imageries and everything, that sooner or later Russia will have to make a decision what to do next, because the Soviet stockpiles are not limitless. All that, there are a lot of pieces of equipment. And this will affect Russia's offensive capabilities, at least, because for the significant offensive against Ukrainian forces, they need a lot of equipment, including heavy equipment, artillery pieces, that they will struggle to replace. Also, the quality of this equipment started to suffer. Before the full-scale invasion, Russia was focused on modernizing it, replacing the old equipment with something developed and constructed in the post-Soviet times, or just even recently. And now it's a combination of everything. We can see cases of using old Soviet tanks from 1950s with some recently manufactured T-90 tanks, but of course in smaller quantities. So, as I used to say, when they announced the partial mobilization, the Russian military transitioned from a semi-professional force to a weird mix of mobilized force, and they keep doing it. And an important issue for them is that these soldiers who are mobilized, they are tired of this war, because just basically 2 years of fighting, these mobilized men demand sending them back, especially those who were literally took out from the labor market, civilian labor market, because of the mental toll, complete removal from the labor market, and because they haven't seen their families. But Moscow decides not to do this, because then they will need to probably announce another wave of mobilization, or basically the demand for a higher number of forces will only increase. So they try to keep these men originally mobilized back in 2022 and replenish those losses with, again, convicts, mercenaries, forced so-called volunteer soldiers, and other people, including actually foreign fighters, who decided to join the Russian military. And as of now, it seems like this issue is being solved, but again, it's always a matter of another offensive operation or high attrition events that would affect the number of soldiers that the Russian military has.
I think it's quite interesting because we tend to hear a lot about Ukrainian manpower issues, but I haven't really heard about Russian manpower issues until basically now. And I think I've assumed so far that Russia is able to gain enough volunteers to basically fill all the gaps. And if out of all the issues, manpower would be one that they don't really have to worry about.
This is, as of now, as of July, like this year, but this is not the top priority issue. But again, considering what kind of measures they did to keep mobilized people in place or replace those losses with, again, foreigners, mercenaries, volunteers, and so on and so forth, it shows that they sometimes use very extraordinary policy options, including, again, banning personnel from leaving the military, sending horrible criminals and convicts to the storm that units, and then also, if they're injured, they're releasing them back in the civilian world. And this shows that, again, the issue persists, but they find measures that are less politically sensitive than announcing another wave of mobilization or just mobilizing other men who, say, who do not want to join the military voluntarily. Also, Russia has a labor market constraints. They need at the same time expanded production and to keep the economy afloat. And from what I know from the economists who actually studied this topic, that another wave of mobilization would have negative attributes to the Russia's production and civilian economy. So there are a lot of variables in this equation, and as of now, they tend to use quite extraordinary measures, but not this large-scale events such as the mobilization to replenish their personnel.
And you've mentioned that if this trend continues, eventually Russian leadership will be forced to make some kind of a decision. And so what would that decision look like, or what options would be they forced to choose between to keep going?
Yeah, it's always a matter of political calculation, because currently, it seems like Putin keeps peddling this maximalist aim of occupying Ukrainian regions and forcing Kiev to basically agree that they to give these territories to Russia, at least in their public rhetoric. But when we look at their actions, I see some concern on the Moscow side. Again, because of the civilian economy, because of the production and the slow degradation of the Soviet stockpiles, because of the sanctions and what's, I think, more importantly, the measures of sanctions enforcement and fighting sanction invasion. Again, very important in all authoritarian states are domestic political calculations, because the number one for authoritarian states is how to keep the leader in power, the undemocratic leader in power. So all of this makes me think that if their maximum demands are met, for example, or at least there is some kind of a frozen conflict or temporary conflict settlement, that will give them enough time to again, to restart the economy, to find new people to fight, and to give them more benefits, actually, than I think some people consider. But if no, and if they have to fight and they suffer casualties, and if if Kiev, Ukraine manages to reconstitute its force, because they also suffer a lot from attrition, and they have manpower issues, and then even start conducting another counteroffensive, then Moscow will have to respond, and this will again another cycle of violence, forced, in my view, another wave of mobilization, because, well, this is a bit of a criminological thinking, but in my view, that Putin and people around him are now even ideologically invested in this conflict. So they see it as quite existential, and I think existential not only in terms of their money and power, but as from the point of kind of ontological security. They look at Ukraine as a sort of anti-Russia, as a project against Russia, and they're probably just even afraid to let it go without defeating Kiev.
But at the same time, I would assume that that they would do everything they could to avoid another mobilization. You've mentioned the manpower and labor shortage and other constraints, but also if there was during the war a dip in Putin's approval rating, it was only after the first wave of mobilization. So I would assume that for those reasons, they might even be worried. They might be worried to try to do the same thing, because a second round might be even more unpopular than the first one.
This depends. I think they look at this from a bit of a different perspective, from terms of risks or potential risks. In my view, people in the presidential administration who actually manages this and usually provide advice what to do next, they look at this as like experiment that no one has ever done. And of course, another wave of mobilization would increase political risk for them, but look how much they invested in legitimizing the war, in giving enormous financial benefits to the soldiers and their families, including to the families who lost their people, to their loved ones, on the front line. And this is actually quite unprecedented for Russia's history, that the government pays so much to their soldiers, especially considering what they did in the Soviet Union when, especially in the Afghanistan war, like, thank you for your service, here's your medal, and we bury your son. Now they not only bury him, but, give a lot of benefits and social status, considering this very close now autocratic nature when criticizing the war is illegal. Of course, this provides both a boost in legitimacy, at least in passive legitimacy, of accepting this war, and sort of thinking that, okay, the government knows what they're doing, maybe we don't like it, but where else can we go? So we got to stick with the plan, whatever the plan is there in Moscow. So, but speaking about this, yes, again, attempts to mobilize maybe again, I think it can potentially play out bad for the Kremlin in terms of, Putin's approval rating, but it can actually be okay. It could be that the economic effects would be more important than the political or ideological, first immediate political or ideological consequences. So it's going to be an experiment again if they announce another wave of mobilization. And I thought, a full disclaimer, that yes, I thought they would actually announce it earlier, but then I didn't expect that their measures to find volunteers and mercenaries be so successful, or at least successful enough to keep the fighting going.
Can we maybe try to put a timeline on that in terms of both the manpower issues and the running out of equipment? When do you expect that these problems that are already visible will really start biting?
Well, that's an excellent question, and it's $1 million question in my view, because a lot depends also on the Ukrainian side and the progress with on the battlefield. If Ukrainians manage to defend their territory and inflict losses on Russia's military, then it will be severe. And also, we don't know about Russia's general plans of another offensive operations, for example. So it's hard for me to answer when this happens. A lot depends on what's going to happen exactly, there on the front, both from the Ukrainian side and how successful they are, and what kind of missile armaments they have provided from the West, but also what's the plan there in Moscow and the guys who develop these offensive operations. Will they start another major offensive operation? Then, of course, there will be a lot of losses. Maybe they decide to keep this grinding offensive, then they will keep the losses a bit more under control. So I would probably refrain from naming specific date because most likely I will be wrong.
Why would they start another offensive if already they are burning through what they have at such a high rate when they're basically just fighting over very small amounts of territory and their losses are so high? I would imagine that if they would try to push for another offensive, these losses would go up even more and they would run out of what they have even sooner.
Yeah, that's a great question. And this shows the complexity of this conflict. In my view, there in Moscow, they also understand this. There's always probably even conflicts between political and military arguments. From the political perspective and also from the intelligence side of things, no one knows what's going to happen in the US election, whether Donald Trump or President Biden would win in the next round of election, what's going to happen in Europe in terms of its defense production expansion and European Defense Initiative and all other programs that are supposed to support Ukraine. And this sort of comes into this risk calculus. So, and some people in Moscow, especially on the civilian side, can be afraid of, say, stability in the United States or Biden stays in power and failures on the European side to provide support to Ukraine. And then they would think, okay, our window of opportunity is closing, also because weather conditions. It's easier to start offensive operations in the summer before this usual break in the muddy season in the fall and spring. So they can potentially advocate for other like radical measures on the front lines. From the military side, they may not have these considerations. They don't have expertise in the strategic political thinking, and they can see things. Okay, we don't have enough artillery pieces, or maybe the fire advantage is not enough, or just pure manpower advantage is not enough for another offensive operation. But in the end, it boils down to the political decision there of Putin personally, but probably some of his key advisors, including the Minister of Defense. So, so you say that it's not an easy answer. It basically shows that this always a matter of who and what parts of the Russian government would be able to convince the top decision maker Putin to the next. And it's a matter also not even what's exactly there, because there's always an information asymmetry, but also expectations and image that Putin receives from the West, from Ukraine, and from his own population and the military.
I want to talk more about what's happening at the Ministry of Defense in Russia. But before we get to that, I had an impression of how you're describing the situation in the Russian military. It would seem to me that a politically sound strategic decision from the Russian perspective might be to try to push for negotiations that would give Russia the break to reconstitute its forces and rebuild its military before it gets to the point where they have to start making these very painful decisions. Would you agree?
A lot depends on the substance of these negotiations and whether there is enough incentives for both sides to agree on this substance. Currently, Moscow shows very maximalist aims, and it gives evidence that probably they are not so concerned about this balance of power against Ukraine. So they think they still have an upper hand and they can pursue this maximalist aims. But also because Kiev was, at least now we see some, insiders information that probably there are some discussions in the Ukrainian capital. But before that, it was a very no negotiations personally with Putin, but also no negotiations on ceding some territory. So probably that's why they were pushing this, because, okay, we still have, I'm kind of speaking, trying to think as if I'm there in Moscow. We still have some kind of military, maybe not big enough, but upper hand against the Ukrainians, more resources and so on and so forth. There's a unity in the West, but also Kiev kind of blocks in the attempts to negotiate with Putin and to cede the territory. Once they see this, that there is a window and there is a possibility that someone in Ukraine actually thinks, okay, we can see this territory and give some victory to Putin, I think the Russian position will change, and we'll see this first, maybe unofficial diplomacy, other attempts to talk, and then we will probably see some formal attempts to negotiate. But again, strategically, in my view, if Putin is in power and it managed to trade some territory, but also maybe even sanctions relief, this will be frozen conflict with the potential another wave of hostilities later, because Russia invested so much and the Putin regime invested so much in it that it's going to be hard for them to demilitarize both the economy, the society, and what's going to happen next in the Russian political regime.
I think before we move to the civilian side of things, I had one more question on this topic that came from a supporter of the podcast who's asking how much of Russian military forces are currently tied in Ukraine, to what extent Russia is full in, and whether it still maintains sufficient military capabilities to, if theoretically there was something else, either an external threat or an internal, some kind of a serious unrest, or perhaps another secession attempt within Russia, if it would still have enough capabilities to address two separate issues at the same time?
Yeah, that's a good question. But whenever someone asks me a similar one, I think of what kind of potential scenario this can be. If we think of something a global conflict as China or other powers, they decide to use Russia's difficult position to this kind of like movie style, Hollywood style scenario to occupy some of its land, then Russia has nuclear weapons that gives a lot of considerations to any potential adversary in terms of assaulting Russia in other parts of its territory. In the West, it seems like not a single European politician wants to actually start a war with Russia. No one wants it here in Europe or in the United States. Then we go to maybe less like smaller risk factors, such as Islamic extremism. We've seen horrible attack on the Grand City Hall in Moscow, or supporting its allies, or supposedly supporting its allies, such as Armenia against Azerbaijan. And then we see that actually, yes, first, Russia is willing to trade its diplomatic allies because of the difficult position and not to have conflict with Azerbaijan and Turkey. What's happened to poor Armenia, who ended up in this bad situation for them, because again, Moscow's trade-offs and willingness to stay on good terms with Azerbaijan and Turkey. But also with if we look at their capabilities to fight religious extremism, that a lot of security forces are now busy with working with the Ukrainians. So, and this creates potential, again, informal, non-state, or room for non-state attacks, and basically degrading Russia's human security. And this is an issue, but how big of an issue this is in terms of the global scale? Yes, Russian people will suffer, but will this affect the global calculus in terms of Russia-Ukraine or Russia-Europe? I don't know. Prague City Hall attack happened. They tied screws on migrants and religious symbols in Russia, but nothing happened. And again, there were attacks in Dagestan. Yes, it creates some regional destabilization, but again, they managed to keep it under control. So currently, I don't see such a significant threat that even with the Russian security forces being busy fighting a war against Ukraine, that would potentially destabilize Russia's political situation. But things can change.
So moving on from what's happening to Ukraine, let's maybe talk about what's happening in Moscow. And now we're in a position where it has been a few weeks, perhaps even a few months, since the purges, since basically the Russian Minister of Defense has been replaced. And we have seen some, if I can put it that way, purges of several high-ranking Russian military and Minister of Defense officials. So if we take a look at it now, after some time has passed and we can properly analyze it, how significant has these events been in your view? And is there anything, or I assume there is, so what can they tell us either about the Russian military or about the Russian Ministry of Defense or Russian politics in general?
Yeah, for Putin, it was a good opportunity to replace a Minister of Defense who didn't who basically failed in preparing the military for the war. And he used this opportunity to appoint Minister Belousov, who is a civilian with significant economic and public policy background before becoming the Minister of Defense. And the official aim was to fight corruption and make the Russian military more efficient, because they spent a lot of money on it. And then it's a matter of efficiency, whether this huge sums of money produce the necessary, say, equipment or personnel they need. In my view, this is not enough, because we've seen in Russia's history, but they also appointed Minister Serdyukov, claiming he would be sort of like a financial manager for the military and would check and put all the financial books under control. But in the end, he started significant radical military reform. But that was peaceful times. Currently, they fight a war, so it makes any significant military reform difficult to achieve. Well, because first, you don't have enough personnel to implement this reform. And second, because you need to it's hard to change those forces that are actually they are fighting inside Ukraine and occupying its territory. But there are some things that the ministers can do, and the civilian minister can potentially be more effective in this regard, especially with this economic experience. It's improving relationship with the military-industrial complex, solving bottlenecks in procurement and delivery of equipment to the soldiers, gathering feedback from commanders and soldiers on what they actually need. And we've seen some changes that are already made that are very incremental, basic bureaucratic changes, but gives evidence that they're actually monitoring this development, but also improving just general management. I wouldn't say command and control, because it's more of a military matter, but management in the Ministry of Defense, those civilians who actually do the job on the civilian side of the civil-military relationship. But a lot will depend. I know that what matters a lot to, first and foremost, to Ukrainians, but also to Western observers, what's going to happen with the actual Russian military there on the front lines, still pending. A lot depends who will be the chief of the general staff. If Gerasimov stays, probably there could be some internal calculations why they want him to stay. Then the likelihood of significant radical military changes would be lower. But if they decide to change Gerasimov to someone younger with military experience, combat experience there in Ukraine, and also supported by deputies from the new generation of Russian military officers, this can open up opportunities for the radical military modernization. Because in my view, a lot of things that Moscow can change are actually it's not material. It's things related to the command and control, skills, military culture, structure of the Russian military, formal requirements, again, financial, bureaucratic bottlenecks, and this can help Russia's military modernize faster, let alone this military equipment that they can procure, for example, from China and other states that support Russia.
Have we already seen any major changes from the new minister?
No major changes, but they announced several incremental, minor changes that I think were met they were positively met by the soldiers. Ideologically, Belousov tried to construct this image that Russia needs to solve this information asymmetry problem, saying basically it's okay to make mistakes, but it would be treason if you lie, and this was met with a lot of praise from so-called Z bloggers, those who support Russian troops there in Ukraine. Also, they started changing the tactical procurement mechanisms, helping units to get their equipment, including civilian equipment, faster and with less bureaucratic hurdles. Also working with the Russian customs, but it's still going. It's not so easy to change, but also they may have changed it already, but the outcomes, the effects of these changes would be cumulative. We'll see them later, probably in fall, winter, this and next year.
And as I've mentioned, together with the replacement of the minister, we have seen those very high-profile cases of military officials removed for corruption charges. To what extent was this really about corruption, specifically those, and to what extent was it just political infighting and military against the FSB, as we've heard. How do you read that?
It's neither exclusively corruption nor political infighting. One important thing I think is everyone should understand about Russia's political system, that corruption is a tool of political control. Like investing democracy is elections, that if you lose election, you lose power. In Russia, all high-ranking officials are supposed to be corrupt to a certain extent, even if they don't want to, because they somehow, sooner or later, would definitely commit an offense by signing off some contract that they didn't know was actually somehow related to fraud or, corrupted deals. And then they would basically sign off their criminal case against them later if the FSB or other security agencies want them to repress them. So corruption is an inherent feature of Russia's political system because it helps to actually make the system so stable. To supporters, it gives access to financial resources and wealth. To the opponents, it actually creates the threat of repression. And when I saw this indictment against Minister of Defense officials and General Staff officers, I was surprised by one thing, is the diversity of their wealth. It's one thing when they charged Ivanov with the Deputy Minister Ivanov with the corruption. He was filthy rich. Even Navalny made an investigation against him, like filthy rich even by North American standards. But then you look at General Shamarin and other military officers, and or General Popov, who currently was put under house arrest. And it's by Russian standards, that's nothing. It's even if, yes, officially it was corruption, but their wealth was standard for officials of this level. But for Popov, it was just not even wealth. It's just general, an apartment and some loans. And it shows that actually there was some political, clear political calculations in that. So they did want to prosecute these individuals for something. That is most likely not related to their corrupted practices. Could be they used it in the case of Shamarin to show as a scapegoat because the Russia's signal capabilities, communications, and all these radio devices was a weak spot at least during the first 2 years, like a year and a half of the invasion. And this is how they decided, on the one hand, to show to the public that they are fighting corruption, removing incompetent military leaders. And on the other hand, with General Popov, this is, I think, even more inter-elite struggle because of his famous case when his telegram message was leaked to the public, where he basically criticized the chief of the general staff, Gerasimov. So these are very interesting episodes, and in my view, there's no one single explanation to why they're happening. But I do think that at least kind of the most likely explanation to this, first, it's indeed removing some absolutely crazily corrupt officials who were not in Belousov's Belousov's set of allies, but were more in the Shoigu's camp. And second, by removing incompetent officials, giving this temporary ideological boost, by showing that actually Moscow is capable of changing incompetent officials. It's kind of politics, but we'll see how it's going to happen. Again, I'm looking forward to what's going to happen with the chief of the general staff and hence his deputies. This would explain a lot what their goals actually are.
And you've mentioned that corruption is inherent part of how Russia works or how Russian politics work. So to what extent does corruption represent a problem for how the military works or for its performance? To what extent is it a problem for its performance? Because I would assume that if you do have corruption as inherent part of the system, it must be a hindrance on its performance, whether it's performance on the battlefield, people who get promoted, or how much money it wastes acquiring stuff. But at the same time, it's probably not as bad as it's sometimes made out to be, because the Russian military is still functioning. And if it was that bad, sometimes when you hear about how much corruption there is, you would expect that none of the Russian tanks would even have wheels to drive on.
Yeah, that's a great question. In my view, these corrupt practices are parts of the rules of the game. Definitely from the objective side, it does affect negatively procurements, everything, quality of equipment, morale, quality of the skills of the military personnel, even tactical equipment, basically what soldiers have, or even their social benefits they receive, because we've seen evidence that some officers blackmail or, just press gang their soldiers to give away their salaries and or benefits to other people. So it does negatively affect, for obvious reasons, Russia's military capabilities, and this is obvious, and I think there is no question about that. But on the other hand, because I think some people usually when they talk about corruption, yes, they have this bigger argument, oh, Russia will collapse because of corruption. I think it gets trickier because everyone knows corruption exists, including people in Russia, including those who support Putin. They know that Russia is corrupt because it's part of the game. That's how the system works. If you want to have a business deal, you even know sometimes 30% of your contract goes to this particular public official. Otherwise, you can leave your job, right? Then find another way to feed your family. And the same in the military. Kind of those who understand how it works, they know that it exists, so they know the rule of the game, and hence they develop their personal strategies of how they interact with military and civilian officials in a way that kind of acknowledges that the corruption can influence their position in the military. Or that the Russian system has such a high level of oppressive capabilities and this military culture that basically says even those who have not acknowledged and have not understood how the Russian system politically works, they will be basically repressed or forced to adopt these rules of the game. As long as, again, the executive system and this political control, the system of political control is actually functioning. And for now, it does. It has enough resources, it has enough personnel to repress those who do not comply with the orders or who try to muddle the waters or raise negative attention to particular civilian military officials about the practices or crimes that they committed. So in this regard, this keeps this equation in balance, that there's on one hand capability, on the other hand corruption. But once we remove this variable, such as, let's imagine there's a black swan scenario, I don't know, some kind of financial crisis, Russia loses a lot of budgetary resources, then they don't have enough resources to feed the security services, hence their repressive capability will suffer. Or there is another kind of movement, such as similar to Prigozhin's movement, which I don't believe would happen again. But again, there's a autonomous group of people who would completely disregard the rules of the game. This, of course, creates a threat and a potential crisis for the Russian military and the Russian regime. But these are contingencies of this kind of high impact, low probability events that's very hard to foresee.
I want to get back to Gerasimov just for a little bit, because you've mentioned it that he was or that he is regarded quite widely as a pretty incompetent leader. And when Shoigu was removed and there were speculations about whether Gerasimov would go as well, I've heard claims that basically as long as he stays, that works out pretty well for Ukraine, because there's someone at the top who's not really helping Russian efforts on the battlefield in any way. Would you say that you agree with that? And if he, obviously we don't know who will replace him, but is there a chance that his replacement would be someone who would actually be a lot more dangerous for Ukraine and by being a lot more capable?
Correct answer, yes. Gerasimov first, Gerasimov does not have any reputation in the Russian military anymore. We basically don't see any evidence from those who are fighting in Ukraine, against Ukraine, any positive evidence that they would support him somehow. There's a lot of criticism, and what stops it from becoming like public, as it was happening during Prigozhin's time, basically that the military Ministry of Defense and the FSB and other security services managed to re-establish practices of censoring and silencing these people who try to raise the problems that Gerasimov was supposed to solve on the higher level. So as long as he's in power, This is good news for Ukraine because, again, it keeps Russia's military failing and preventing them from modernizing its forces. First, because Gerasimov has been in command for more than 10 years already, and he's a relatively old man, and being the chief of the general staff is a very difficult job. It's basically like a 24 hours job that you don't have anything, you just need to serve, and you're responsible for everything happening in the military. Second, we've seen evidence that he actually wanted to resign a few years before the full-scale invasion. I think it was 2019 or 20. And they probably didn't let him go. They even announced that he would become the head of this kind of think tank or NGO in Moscow at the Academy of Military Sciences. And this is usually kind of a good post for a high-ranking military commander to go after retiring. And then he stayed in power. And what it means, especially with the minister like Shoigu, that people lose incentives on the one hand to work better. Second, they think that everything is okay as they see fit. So there's no innovation and thinking. Then the feedback and monitoring mechanisms suffer because, again, the same people are kind of they're more concerned about their own vision, how it should be, than actually what's happening in reality. So this gives several factors that put Russia's military in a disadvantage. And that's why I've been saying that this position and their relationship, the relationship of the second step would be the relationship of a new chief of the general staff with the Minister of Defense Belousov, would determine whether first Russia will have attempts to modernize and to reform its military, and second, whether these attempts would be successful. Because if they have good relationship, and this, for example, is a military veteran from fighting against Ukraine, relatively young, brings also similar people to the as his deputies in the general staff, and then Belousov, who is apparently willing to give money and control how this money is being spent. This is bad news. This means that they would be capable of, at least the likelihood of reform would increase.
So I'd like to look at the future of the Russian military, because I think we often focus on what's happening now and what's going to be happening in the near-term future, but most people are not actually aware that Putin, if I'm not mistaken, has already made decisions and given out assignments for Russian MOD leadership to reform the militaries for what happens after the war in Ukraine. And one of the takes that I've heard on appointment of Belousov was that his task is not just to improve the Russian military performance in Ukraine, but actually help build a military that would be able to then fight and face NATO forces. So is that true? Is that really what is currently going on? And what would such reform and such future Russian military look like?
Yeah, that's another $1 million question.
Thank you for listening to this conversation. If you'd like to hear the rest of it, you can find it on my Patreon. Click the link in the description or go to patreon.com/decodinggeopolitics. And if you decide to become a supporter, you get bonus content, Patreon-only episodes, and you will be able to ask questions to my future guests.